All right, we are live. So good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on your location around the world. I'm Megan Phillips, joined by Jody Ambrose, and we are the co-founders of the Train with Trust project. We're a nonprofit dedicated to making animal behavior information accessible and to promoting the use of evidence-based training practices. And of course, again, we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Sue Dyson joining us today for our discussion about saddle fit. This is a very dense topic, so we're going to get through as much as we are able to today and leave some meaningful contributions for people to have a better understanding about saddle fit and what they can do on their own to help ensure appropriate saddle fit. So just like Dr. Sue has developed methods for us to use measurable, quantifiable criteria to evaluate the possibility of musculoskeletal pain in our horse companions, she and her colleagues have recognized the need to bring that same measurable, quantifiable criteria to bear on the matter of saddle fit. So she has done a lot of significant study on this and, introduced the idea that if we can see and measure indicators of pain, there's no reason we can't do this with objective evidence, looking at the saddle fit in our horses. So to not delay this conversation, which will be very engaging, I'm going to turn things over to Jody, and I will be in the background looking at your questions. We have some pre-submitted questions that people sent in to us, and we hope to answer as many questions as we can today during this live. And for those that we can't answer, we will do our best to answer questions offline on our blog. So I'm going to hand things over, and we'll talk later in the Q&A part of the program.
Okay, hi everyone. Oops. Oh shoot. Okay, sorry. She's going to turn her screen off. I am Jody Ambrose, and I am looking forward to talking to Dr. Dyson about this topic. I was a trainer, am a trainer, have been riding and training for the better part of 40 years. And so I've bought a lot of saddles. I've ridden in a lot of saddles. I've worked with a lot of saddle fitters and learned from them. And yet, reading some of Dr. Dyson's research, I found all kinds of information I didn't know. And I found clarification of a lot of information that I had been given conflicting information about. It's pretty typical, I think, in the horse world for us to just believe what we're told. And in some cases, I've been told opposite things are true. So I'm finding out what the research shows rather than just what someone's opinion is. And I find, like Megan said, it's a great opportunity to be able to really measure something that we've been depending on our intuition and things that we've gathered over the years. So I'm going to start out, Dr. Dyson, I'd like to ask you, what is the prevalence of good saddle fit versus poor saddle fit? How many horses out there do you think are going around in saddles that are causing problems?
Well, there have been a variety of different studies done, both in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. There was a recent study published from Switzerland looking at sports horses in normal work, and they found 90% of the horses had ill-fitting saddles, which is a staggering statistic. In the UK, the figures have ranged between about 37% to 60%, and that's dependent on the horse populations. So the 60% was normal sports horses out there working, considered by their owners to be functioning normally, although quite a few of them did have low-grade lameness or other problems in canter. To the lowest figure, 37%, which was in a study when we were examining horses that had presented with poor performance. And all of those horses had professionally assisted saddle fit in the previous 1 to 3 months. But despite that, we still had a figure of 37%, which we felt was so creating so much discomfort that we needed to change the saddle to an intervention saddle before we proceeded with further aspects of the investigation. And that change of saddle in that 37% in all of the horses produced horses that had improved gait quality and improved demeanor. So it really is a significant problem. And I think that the actual incidence is going to vary depending upon geographical area and also the availability of good saddle fitters, which is variable from country to country.
And you said that you observed changes in movement and gait and demeanor. Can you go a little bit more into depth about what kinds of observations you make when you see a horse in a saddle that doesn't fit well versus one that
the most common problems are either a pommel that is too low or tight tree points or a wide tree such that it sits down too far and the tree points press into the underlying muscles. And in those horses, we see often a very unsteady head carriage, the head moving about up and down. Those horses have short forelimb steps, and occasionally they will actually show overt forelimb lameness, particularly if they're turning to the left or to the right. They will often hold their backs rather stiffly, so they're bracing the back. And if you compare before and afterwards, you can often see that afterwards there's an improvement in the hind limb gait as well as in the forelimb gait. Ironically, if you take a horse which is stiffening its back as a direct effect of an ill-fitting saddle, when you replace that ill-fitting saddle by a better fitting saddle, actually lameness may become apparent behind. So they were bracing their backs because of the saddle and effectively concealing hind limb lameness. When you take away the pain from the ill-fitting saddle, they let go of their backs and move their backs more freely, and then any underlying problems actually become more obvious. So the overriding things with the ill-fitting saddles is that they often have an unsteady head carriage, shortened forelimb step, shortened hind limb step, and bracing the back.
Okay, and if you fit the saddle, you refit the saddle, change it, and look at it while the horse is standing, does that guarantee that once the horse is moving, it's going to fit? Do things change as the horse is moving?
Well, it depends how the horse works. If the horse is working properly, during work, if it's moving its back properly, the back should be in slight flexion. So the back comes up. So a gullet that fitted the horse in a static position may no longer fit with the horse moving correctly. And also during work, we have demonstrated that the back dimensions increase. The muscles probably have increased blood supply and the muscles increase in their dimensions. So the width of the horse's back changes measurably during a work period if the horse is working correctly. So the size of the saddle has to be adequate to accommodate that slight increase in dimensions. If the saddle doesn't fit, those changes in dimensions don't occur. And that's really important for a young horse, because a young horse hasn't got very well developed back muscles. In order to develop them, it's got to be able to use its back muscles properly. And therefore, the fit of the saddle in that young horse is of crucial importance to allow those muscles to function properly and therefore to facilitate their increase in bulk as they become used more.
So basically, the more you do everything right, the more you need to be concerned about saddle fit and changes that might occur, it sounds like, because the better you ride the horse, the more their muscling's going to change, the more they're going to...
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think it is as crucial to be reevaluating saddle fit in an advanced Grand Prix horse, for example, because it's developed those muscles.
Gotcha.
But in the younger horse, it is of crucial importance because it's got to be able to use its back properly in order to develop those muscles properly.
Sure. now we've talked about the fit for the horse. I know that a lot of your research also involves the fit for the rider, which is interesting to me because in all my years of training, I think for the most part, the only part of a saddle that people really worry about for themselves is the seat size. Like, you know, I ride in a 16 or I ride in a 17 or an 18. I know that some people pay attention to flap length, but other than that, I don't think a lot of people give a lot of attention to the fit for the rider. Can you talk a little bit about what factors besides seat size are important for people to consider when they're choosing a saddle?
Well, the aim of the saddle is to facilitate you riding in balance, such that you are as close to the horse's center of gravity as possible, and so that it will facilitate you being in rhythm with the horse's movement as far as is possible. And in order to do that, you have to be in the correct position. So ideally with your shoulder, hip, and heel in alignment. A saddle that fits you properly will allow you to do this. Then you just have to work on your own position so that you have, for example, a strong lower leg position so that you are supporting yourself in the correct position. Now, if you have a saddle which places you too far to the back of the saddle, then the only way you can be in balance with the horse is by leaning your upper body forwards. And that causes you to use more muscular effort. Now, if you are, there are lots of factors that come into play here. It's not just your seat size, it's your body height size, and also the relative lengths of your trunk versus your limbs. If you've got very long legs and you've got a relatively short saddle flap, then inevitably you're going to be finishing up sitting too far back in the saddle. If you have a bigger saddle flap, which accommodates more of your leg in the right position, then you will be able to sit more into the center of the saddle. Then another factor which is adjustable, as well as the size of the saddle flap, is the position of the bars from which the stirrup leathers are going to be suspended. And they can be varied in their position. So it's the length of the seat, the position of the bars of the saddle, and also the shape and size of the flaps that are three integral issues that influence what position that you can be in the saddle. Ideally, as a rider, and I speak now as a rider, not as a veterinarian, but as a rider, you should be able to stand in your stirrups and remain in balance without having to tilt your upper body too far forwards. If you can't do that, then the saddle is not placing you in the right position.
That's a nice simple thing that people can do themselves. I'm wondering what are some other things that people can do that are, you know, measurable, that they can know that they're figuring out that the saddle fits them, fits the horse. I think a lot of people are frustrated because obviously you get a professional saddle fitter out and that's the best possible thing you can do, but horses are changing all the time, their movement is changing all the time, people's bodies are changing all the time. What are some ways that people can observe what's happening and sort of give themselves tools to determine that it's time that they need to either make a change of saddles or have their saddle refitted? For instance, when you're tacking up, what are some signs that you might see that a problem is going on, or will you see a problem before you get on?
Well, I think we've demonstrated, because we did a study when we looked at the behavior of horses being tacked up. And one of the important factors was that horses are more likely to show abnormal behavior during tacking up if they have an ill-fitting saddle or if they are lame, so they are anticipating discomfort when they're ridden. So if the horse is constantly shifting weight, it's fidgeting, it's turning its head round to the girth as you're doing up the girth, if it's kicking, if it's swishing its tail, if it's putting its ears back, all of those are not normal behaviors during tacking up. The normal horse with a well-fitting saddle, which has been trained appropriately, should just stand still quietly with a happy demeanor. And if it doesn't, it means that something is amiss. Now, with respect to what things about the saddle can you easily check? Well, you can easily check about the height of the pommel, and that needs to be done when you're in the saddle. So it's basically the two-finger rule, putting two fingers like this underneath the front of the saddle. They should be able to fit in very easily, both with you sitting in the saddle and with you standing in the stirrups. When you stand in the stirrups, you're placing more force on the front of the saddle, so the front of the saddle will drop down a little. So still, with those two fingers, they should not be getting squashed to be sure that the pommel is fitting appropriately. One other thing that you can do is both on and off the horse, you can run your fingers underneath the front part of the saddle, and your fingers should be able to pass underneath the tree points with reasonable ease. If your fingers get jammed, then the tree points are too tight. And that's one of the simple problems that can be addressed. Now, the other thing is you can either get somebody to video you on your horse, or you can observe somebody else on your horse and watch the movement of the saddle. A normal saddle should remain in contact with the horse's back. If the back of the saddle is bouncing up and down, that's not a well-fitting saddle. It shouldn't do that. If the back of the saddle is moving from side to side a lot, it shouldn't do that. That also means that it's not fitting correctly. And then there are things that you can do after you've ridden the horse. So if you take off the saddle and whatever pads you've got underneath, and then look at the horse's back. If the horse has been working reasonably hard, it will have sweated under the saddle. If there is a dry patch underneath the front of the saddle, where the panels are in contact with the back, that means the pressure has been excessive and has prohibited sweating in that area. If the saddle has been moving in that area too much, you will see that the hair will be ruffled. If you look at the underpart of the saddle cloth or saddle pad that you've been using, you will often see a dry spot mirroring where the dry spot is on the horse, whereas the rest of the saddle area, which is in contact with the pad, will show evidence of sweating. So you can look at both the pad and the horse. And then if the saddle is moving excessively from side to side, particularly during the winter months, that may induce abnormal hair wear underneath the saddle. And that's something which is much more obvious during the winter months when the hair coat is more likely to be pulled out than during summer when the hair coat is so much shorter.
So a couple of things in what you just said. For one thing, that's really interesting about the sweat marks, because that's the kind of thing I was talking about when I said that there's a lot of conflicting information. I know that I was told to check sweat marks when I was younger, and then at a certain point I was told, no, there's no correlation between sweat marks and saddle fit. And you're saying that studies show, right, that these sweat marks are associated with poor fit?
Absolutely, absolutely. There was a study done in which they actually measured the pressures under the saddle, and the higher the pressures were associated with reduced sweating. So there's a very strong correlation there.
And I'm pretty sure that all of your research is focused on English saddles. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. I have had some brief encounters with Western saddles, but I don't think I'm in a position to comment much about their fit, other than to say that unquestionably the tree points, they can be too tight. I mean, when I was in Montana last year, I looked at some of the saddles, and when I was in Texas, also in the fall, I looked at some saddles, and there's no doubt that some of the basic problems that we see in English saddles are the same in Western saddles. And I talked with an American saddle fitter at length when I was in Montana, and she was describing very much the same problems.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And in in terms of measuring how much clearance there is between the panels of the spine, is there a rule of thumb how much space the spine
Um,
needs?
well, if you look at the gullet of the saddle, which is the space between the two panels, then as a rule of thumb, you need to be able to get a hand's breadth in along there, and particularly for the bigger warm
From
blood
the
type,
front and back?
both front and back. Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes. One other
Because
thing
that's
I didn't mention about inspection of the back, which is relevant to the gullet, is the development of soft tissue swellings on the horse's back after exercise. These tend to be very transient. They occur under the narrowest part of the saddle, so the twist of the saddle, which corresponds with about the 13th, 14th, or 15th thoracic vertebrae, depending upon the horse's shape and size. And you will see transient soft tissue swellings which develop either on the top of the back or just to the side of the back. And we believe that these are induced by either a gullet that is too narrow or the saddle slipping to one side and the gullet moving and the edge of the panel coming up against the spinous processes, causing focal irritation. And those soft tissue swellings reflect that the saddle is not fitting optimally.
So that's something you would look for immediately after you take the saddle
Yes,
off.
yes. But they may persist for an hour or so, but if you come back in 5 hours, they will have disappeared.
And that would be basically sort of where the rider sits in that area.
Yeah.
I think that's not one that I had been taught to look for, but I think I've seen it plenty of times. Sounds familiar. You mentioned girthiness, reaction to the girth. We talked a little bit about the shape of saddles. Is there research into the shape of girths, the lengths of girths, how girths are attached that people should know?
There is one study which looked at the conventional parallel-sided girths versus contoured girths. With the parallel-sided girths, they indicated that the highest pressures were concentrated just behind the elbow on each side. And those pressures were pretty high relative to other parts where the girth was in contact with the horse's side. By the development of this contoured girth, and they were specifically looking at the girth manufactured by Fairfax, which also has some material differences, they were able to show that the pressures were reduced by using this contoured girth. And they also did some kinematic evaluation of the horses, and some of their stride characteristics improved as well. Now, the thing with this research is it was just a one-off trial. It looked at each horse with its normal girth and then each horse with the contoured girth, and measured the differences in the pressures and the difference in the gait parameters. What it did not do was look at whether or not those changes with the contoured girth were maintained over many weeks or months, or whether it was just a single change and the horse would revert. And then you have to remember that these contoured girths come in different lengths. So it's not just a question of saying, I want a contoured girth, I'm going to go out and buy a contoured girth. You have to buy a contoured girth that fits your horse. And I've certainly seen horses which they've paid a lot of money. They were originally £180 per girth. They've gone up, they're now more than £200 per girth. So they're not cheap. And there are some horses who get worse in their performance with the contoured girth because presumably that girth doesn't fit them. In some, you will see that the girth doesn't fit flat on the horse's belly and it tilts, and then you get this ridge of pressure concentrated on the back margin of the girth, which can't be comfortable for the horse. So I think one has to be very careful into how you interpret this work. I think it is probably a good idea to have a contoured girth, but it is critical that the girth fits the shape of any individual horse. And that's going to be influenced not just by the size of the horse's thorax, but also the shape of the horse's thorax, and therefore where the girth will sit. Because you have some horses with very barrel-shaped thoraxes, which kind of become narrower towards the front of the chest, and therefore that pulls the girth forward, which is not where these contoured girths were designed to be. So there's a lot of factors that come in here. So it's not just a simple thing of one thing being right for all horses. You have to treat each horse as an individual.
Absolutely, and an individual that changes over time as well.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we did a study when we followed more than 100 horses every 2 months over a year, looking at their back dimensions. And we were looking at them every 2 months, measuring the back dimensions at standardized locations, the 18th, the 13th, and the 8th thoracic vertebrae. And you could see measurable changes within 2 months, which is quite disturbing, really, in that you have to think about how comfortable you are in a shoe that fits you versus a shoe that doesn't fit you. Mm-hmm. And it's the same for the horse and the saddle. So if it can change dimensions within 2 months, then we have to say, well, how frequently should we be getting our saddle fit checked?
Right. That's a question that we've had submitted by someone, is how often do you recommend having a professional?
I think with what I know now, which is not what I knew when I was riding seriously, unfortunately, I would recommend now that it should be checked every 3 months. It may not have to be changed, but to me, it is such an integral part of optimizing performance that to have the saddle checked every 3 months, I think, is money well spent, and better spent than that on a blingy bridle, just to be provocative.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think there are people that don't prioritize it, and then there are people who do, but maybe don't have access to it, that are coming to them every 3 months. And so I feel like there's been a lot of research. There's a lot more resources now than when you and I were competing seriously, to learn about anatomy, biomechanics, saddle fit, but we don't have the tools, like you were talking about, measuring the horse in certain spots with, the classic tracing the curve or the gullet gauges. I've even seen now they have laser things to measure the back. I don't know how you feel about those, or if you have any opinion on those. But we don't have access to that, and sometimes we don't have access to a professional. So I think what I would like to know is, and we've talked a little bit about this, there are ways that people can determine if their saddle is starting not to fit. For instance, their horses acting different in tacking up, their horses moving differently. You can do these measurements with your hands of the pommel and the gullet. All of those things are tools that we can use to try to catch things early, before, just like with the 24 behaviors, catch problems before they become serious problems. I know a lot of people, myself included, have a pretty good eye for eyeballing if something looks like it fits or not. But what if we get the sense that the saddle doesn't fit, and it's either between the 3 month fitting, or we can't get the saddle fitter for longer than 3 months? I know a lot of people will try and solve that problem with pads or shims. Can you talk a little bit about the types of pads, what they may or may not be able to do, what you don't want to do with pads?
Well, pads may help in terms of changing the pressures. So they can be a short-term measure that may create improvement. And I say may with caution, because if you're putting more material underneath the saddle, you may actually be making things potentially worse if you are, for example, filling up the gullet. And whatever you put underneath the saddle needs to stay off the horse's dorsal midline. So the gullet is there to design such that you don't have pressure, downward pressure, on the tops of the spinous processes. If you then go ahead and put a pad on, which doesn't have any mechanism to keep it up off the horse's back, the pad will get progressively pulled down and tighter during a work period, and can itself cause pressure, which is not a good thing. The use of gel pads is a bit, I don't know about the word controversial is the right word, but they're often marketed as providing some shock absorption. But to my knowledge, there is no actual scientific data to support that. Gel pads, I think, can produce some reduction in movement of a saddle which is moving excessively. The thing one has to be careful about with gel pads is that gel pads are designed not to be placed directly on the horse's back. Because if you have a gel pad directly on the horse's back and the horse is worked hard, then these gel pads create a lot of heat, and they can create so much heat that they can cause focal burns of the skin, which are really painful to the horse. So if you're going to use a gel pad, it needs to be on top of some other pad, so it is not in direct contact with the horse's back. Now, shims can be useful as a short-term measure again, perhaps to try and rebalance the saddle. One thing I didn't talk about with respect to rider position and the overall shape of the saddle is whether the saddle seat is horizontal in the middle, whether it tips forwards or it tips backwards. If the saddle seat tips backwards, it will push you further back in the saddle. So you will finish up effectively in a chair seat. So your shoulder, hip, and heel cannot be in alignment. If that is the case, as a short-term measure, you can put shims underneath the back of the saddle to raise the saddle, and hopefully then finish up with at the front, the middle of the saddle being horizontal. And you can test, you can eyeball the saddle and in terms of its inclination. Is it straight? Does it tip forward or does it tip backwards? Alternatively, you can just put a small round ball on the top of the saddle and see where it finishes up. If the saddle is horizontal in the middle, then it stays in the middle. If it tips forward, then the ball rolls forward. If it tips back, the ball rolls backwards. So that's a very simple test you can use.
That's a nice little trick. And a couple of things came up when you were talking about that. So often I'll see a saddle that tips backwards, but it's, from my perspective, it's because the saddle's placed too far forward on the withers. Can you talk a little bit about how placement of the saddle affects fit?
It's very interesting if you look at the different disciplines that show jumpers are notorious for putting their saddles far forward across the world, America, Europe, everywhere I go, I watch people put the saddles too far forward. And that is really bad for the horse's movement, because the shoulder blade, when the horse's leg goes forward, the shoulder blade goes backwards. And the shoulder blade is going to impact with the panels of the saddle and the tree points if the saddle is too far forward. So you're going to impair fall in movement by having the saddle too far forwards. But most saddles that are placed too far forwards will progressively move backwards during a work period. So they don't stay too far forwards, they work backwards. But I see show jumpers get off their horses and reposition the saddles further forward again. And this is just crazy. It makes no sense at all.
No, that's how I was taught. I started out in hunter jumpers and I was taught to put it on the neck basically and slide it just far enough back. And then, there's also saddles that I've seen put on too far back as well, and they don't slide forward as much, and they just stay too far back. There's Megan again, but I had more questions I want to ask.
I think that's fine. You have questions. We do have a couple of questions from people who were in the chat. Okay. And so did you want to do a wrap-up question first, or do we want to look at these real quick? And
I think wanted, maybe some of the questions that are asked will help sort of get to this, but I don't know if it's the same in the UK. In the US, it's really common that saddle fitters are working for the company that makes the saddles. A lot of times they're trained by the company, and they are, they have a little bit of a conflict of interest that fitting the saddle you have is not the way that they make their money. They make their money by selling you a new saddle. And so I would just like to hear what you have to say a little bit about picking a saddle fitter, making sure that they know what they're talking about, making sure that they're the right ones, questions to ask a saddle fitter when they come, because just because they work for a company doesn't mean that they're not well trained and educated. It just makes it hard for the person who isn't trained to know what to look for and what to ask.
Yes, I think it applies across the board, because even in the UK, we have those people who are working for companies and are being trained by them. And then we have another group of people who have undergone specialist training and examination and are qualified saddle fitters of the Society of Master Saddlers. But any saddle fitter can only carry a limited range of stock, because it's expensive to invest in saddles. So they will always have a vested interest to, if you're purchasing a new saddle, to purchase a saddle from them. And this is when I think it can be sometimes helpful to have a third party present who can independently say, well, your horse doesn't look very comfortable. It's clearly not comfortable in that saddle. And a good saddle fitter, I think, would say, well, I'm sorry, I don't think your saddle fits. I can try adjusting it. And then if they can't adjust it adequately, they then may have to say, and I have not got a saddle that is going to be optimal for your horse, rather than say, this is the best that I can do, and the best that you can do when you're spending a large sum of money on a new saddle is not good enough, in my view. And the whole concept now, you see saddles for sale on eBay. How can you possibly buy a saddle on eBay without assessing that it's appropriate for your horse? It might look like a good deal financially, but it's a very bad deal if it doesn't finish up fitting your horse. Or you.
Yeah.
Equally important. And that's why
right.
One thing I want to know from the saddle fitter is the saddle fitter going to see me ride the horse doing what I want to do with the horse? That is an absolutely crucial part. Is the saddle fitter got the sufficient knowledge to know whether the saddle not only fits the horse, but also fits the rider? And those things are absolutely fundamental as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that even some of the best saddle fitters I've worked with don't always look at that, whether it fits me. Some do. The saddle fitters that I prefer to work with are exactly how you describe. They'll adjust your saddle if you want. They'll sell you a saddle if you want. And there's all kinds of discussion in between about why and how to evaluate that myself. So that's, educating yourself, I think, is the best way to protect yourself, so that when you have those discussions, not that you're ever going to be a saddle fitter, but you can have those conversations with the saddle fitter and understand what questions to ask and what the answers mean.
Yes, and look so carefully at the horse's gait quality and its behavior, because it is absolutely amazing how quickly they will change in a saddle that fits well and a saddle that doesn't fit well. It makes an enormous difference.
That seems like a good spot to ask some questions from the crowd. I think we also have some pre-submitted questions too.
Yeah.
Megan, do you have?
Yeah. The couple of questions, one I think is going to be a firm yes, which is, could we please have the reference of the study about the volume of the horse back getting overall wider during the work? And if you guys are already checking in on our social media, that is excellent, but we do have a lot of resources on the 24 Horse Behaviors site. And Dr. Dyson, will you be able to provide that reference so that we can look that up, or will that be something that's an academic journal?
It's in an academic journal, but I can provide the reference and the abstract. And if anybody wants the full paper, they can apply directly to me by email, and then I can provide it. It's not open access, so it has to be a direct request to me, and then I can send it to the individual.
Okay.
We can certainly post the abstract on the website and the reference.
Great.
And we can put some text saying if you want the full study, we can email. And I was also going to add, someone online this week had asked about anticipating pain in the cross ties, and I had looked up your study on the facial and behavioral changes while tacking up, and I did see that it had been published in the AAP magazine, I think. So I was going to ask you for permission to put that on the website, or ask them if we can put that on or another in some form, because I think that's also really valuable information.
Yeah, so we do have a lot of articles, and I've been trying to put the newer information that Dr. Dyson is providing us towards the forefront of all those. So we'll get those uploaded in the next few days or so. The other question was a little bit more specific, and let me pull up my notes document again. Someone has an off the track thoroughbred who they're saying won't move forward from walk in the past couple of lessons, and wondering, could this be saddle related?
Unquestionably, it could be saddle related, but there are a host of different problems that it could be. So one would have to go through a systematic method of the elimination of the potential causes. It unquestionably demonstrates that the horse must be uncomfortable for whatever reason. But as I say, you'd need to go through systematically eliminating various different things.
Well, and I have to say, I just think that that's one of the greatest outcomes of the wider reach of the 24 behaviors, the ridden horse pain ethogram, and these scientific findings getting into journals for lay people as well as horse professionals, trainers. Is that these are conversations that people are asking these questions more readily, of instead of what's wrong with this horse that it won't move, what is wrong going on for this horse that I have control over and can make better to help this horse behave the way I want it to behave. So I love that outcome. Those are the only two questions I have seen so far. Jody, if you want to.
Can I jump in at the end of that question? As a behavior consultant, I see this a lot. I see horses that don't want to move forward. And just anecdotally, I'll say 100% of the time it was pain related. I've never seen a horse that won't move forward for behavioral reasons. It's always discomfort on some level. And so saddle obviously is the easiest thing to swap out and try. And if it changes things, then there's your answer. But a lot of times I see people trying to train through that resistance, and I've never seen it not having at least an element of pain or discomfort, whether it's the feet, whether it's the saddle, whether it's joints, whether it's neck. You know, there's that it could be that, you know, a million different things, but it's always something like that.
Yeah, I would agree. 100%.
Did you say, Megan, that there's no more questions there?
Yeah, those are the two that we've gotten so far in our chat stream, and then I think there were some of the previously submitted questions that
I had
to proceed with
to run through those. Okay, we had someone ask about thigh blocks on, particularly on dressage saddles, and the sort of newer design of saddles that have the higher cantle and the bigger thigh blocks. What can you tell us about that?
I think it's become very fashionable in the dressage world. I think for some riders, they feel more secure because they're more wedged into position. I personally don't like them. I don't want to feel wedged in position. I want to feel that I can move my body a little. And if you watch some of the very good dressage riders, they do move a little with their bodies. If you don't watch, for example, Isabel Worth, who's been one of the greatest riders that we've had, she has quite a lot of movement in her position, which she wouldn't be able to do in one of these saddles that wedges you. So I don't like them. And I don't think that they favor optimal riding. But I fully appreciate that some people feel safer because they feel that if the horse, for example, spooks, they're more likely to stay with the horse.
Yeah, I'll add, as a rider and as a coach, I'm not a huge fan either. However, there are some saddles that have a fairly large thigh block, but if it fits correctly, and this is something I learned from my saddle fitter, if it fits correctly, your leg is the right length for the flap, your leg should not be up against it. It shouldn't be wedged. It can help create sort of a space for your leg, almost like a little canal that your leg goes through down the flap that can actually, for me, I've found make the saddle more comfortable, but I don't feel trapped in it. So my leg will be not flat up against the thigh block, but there's just a little bit of a dip that my leg can rest in that makes it a little bit easier. So and I've worked with riders both on horses and on the simulators and seen that when their leg is up against the flap, because we had one saddle for the simulator and sometimes it didn't fit people. If their thigh was right up against the thigh block, it often was destabilizing, sort of counterintuitively.
There is a very recently published study on thigh blocks and the design of thigh blocks. And it was demonstrated that the actual shape of the thigh block and therefore the rider's interface with the thigh block was important with respect to the horse's movement quality. So
that's interesting.
So that was published just a week ago, I think.
Oh wow! I wonder if we can find a summary of that, because that's fascinating. I had no idea they were doing that. Okay, let's move on.
You can move on to one, but I do have another live question as well to pop in.
Go ahead.
So the next live question was about short tree points versus long tree points. Should the gullet, and that was the first part of the question, and then should the gullet bars match the T10 tracing or shoulder?
Well, there's a lot of controversy about these things and not a lot of hard evidence. So particularly with respect to the last question, in terms of the tree points, I think it's the shape of the tree points that's probably more important than their absolute length, in that you've got tree points that are absolutely straight and you've got tree points that are curved backwards. And the tree points that are straight, particularly if they're long, are going to be a problem. But it does depend very much on the horse's shape as well. So I don't think you can make sweeping generalizations and say all long tree points are bad and all short tree points are good. It does depend upon the saddle and the way in which the saddle sits on the horse. But a tree point that is curved slightly backwards is going to be better than one which is absolutely straight.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Should I go ahead with another one?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So someone asked about wool flocking versus foam panels. Do you have an opinion on that?
I don't think there is any scientifically based work that has objectively looked at the interface of the saddle with the horse, comparing directly foam versus wool. Having spoken to many fitters, I think there is a general feeling that it is with wool flocking, there is more adjustability possible than with foam flocking. So I would tend on the basis of that to favor wool flocking.
Okay.
But I mean, it is remarkable when you think about how much money we spend on saddles, how little basic research there has been done on the materials used for saddles. And we just continue with the same traditions. If you read the blurb that are on many saddle vendors' websites, you will see all sorts of claims about things which aren't actually scientifically proven. So I think you need to be have a healthy skepticism when you're reading this stuff, to realize that many of the things that are claimed are not based up by any form of study.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing, that a lot of the innovation of saddles that has happened in the last, 50 years, because saddles have been pretty much the same in a lot of ways for thousands of years, but it seems like more and more companies are offering something different, some sort of claim to new technology. And I've never seen those claims come from anywhere except the company that's selling that product. So it is interesting that, there haven't been studies that really show that any of these things are worth it, or better than what we've done in the past. Along that line, there's also a lot of those sorts of claims with saddle pad technology. And I know someone had asked specifically about the crisp fleece pads, and now they make a saddle, I think, but I think it's more of like a treeless pad, sort of, treeless saddle, bareback pad, whatever you want to call it. You had mentioned that the pad needs to be off the dorsal spine. That actually, I think, is probably a little bit shocking to a lot of people, because I think people that use cotton pads a lot of the time don't pull them up into the gullet to get them off the spine. Those, gel pads, fleece pads, all the newfangled types of pads, I think, do tend to sit flat on the back. And you're saying that that's not good, right?
My observation is that horses don't like them. They go better if there isn't that pressure there.
Okay, and that would go for treeless saddles as well, right? Because
I think it depends very much. I don't think you can lump all treeless saddles together.
Okay.
And the intervention saddle that I use from a clinical perspective, if I have a horse with an ill-fitting saddle and I want to change the saddle, I have a flexible saddle which does not have a tree, which accommodates many different sizes of back, both shape and dimension. And I find this, at least on a short-term basis, makes horses very much more comfortable. That's not to necessarily say that a fit of any form of flexible saddle should not be individualized. Of course, it should be over a longer-term basis.
And when you say flexible saddle, would a saddle with an adjustable tree fall in that category as well?
No, they don't. No, the saddles with an adjustable tree are actually fixed. They just can be changed in terms of their shape and size.
And is that something that you have an opinion on, whether those saddles?
Well, I think you always have to think. You can adjust the gullet plates, so you can adjust the width at the front of the saddle, but it's not doing anything with respect to the remainder of the saddle. And so you might improve fit at the front, but that doesn't necessarily equate with improving the fit throughout the saddle. So it gives you a certain degree of flexibility, but when you look at the back dimensions, for example, changes that occur with work, there are greater changes that are occurring further back than the front of the saddle.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so there's one more question about, it's not new technology, but it's a change that's happened in saddles. And then I have one more question about something like that too. So the billets used to just be, you'd have 2 or 3 billets coming straight down. And now a lot of saddles have the point billets, or some sort of version of, it comes through the thigh block, it they cross, all those kinds of things. Is there any research into the effect of those?
No, there's no research. I think that it is the view of many saddle fitters that having more flexibility as to where the girth is attached to facilitates keeping a saddle stable on different shapes of horses. So the availability to have 3 billets versus 2 and the position of the third one gives more flexibility with horses which have back shapes that are difficult to fit and the saddles tend to move excessively.
So in other words, don't just attach to the billets that you think you need to use.
No, I think you can experiment to some extent.
Right. That's actually a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. That's another thing that people have control over that they can do is try changing the configuration of the billets. And I can't remember, did you talk about length of girth?
No, I didn't talk about length of girth. And I think to an extent that is personal preference in terms of whether you want a long girth or a short girth. I mean, obviously all dressage saddles come with short girths. The important thing is that where the buckles are positioned, because there are varying levels of sensitivity down the horse's girth region. So I think it is important where the girth straps finish up, so that they're not over the most sensitive areas, because some horses will become very, very reactive. And the other thing that one needs to consider is to whether or not to use a girth with an elastic inset or not. And if you're using a girth with an elastic inset, should they be on both sides or just one side? And how tight should you do the girth up? I think there is a tendency perhaps to over tighten girths more than is necessary. And that's not going to be comfortable for the horse. And I think one should be thinking about not excessively tightening girths. And I think with girths with elastic insets, there is a tendency to do that. And some horses don't like that. I have vivid recollections of riding a horse called Buck. What nobody told me was, and this was at Bruce Davidson's, what nobody told me was that Buck should not be ridden with a girth with an elastic inset. The day I was given a girth with an elastic inset with him, he exploded in a series of bucks the entire distance down the field until he got to the fence where I was deposited. So this horse was very, very sensitive to excessive pressure created by elastic inset girths.
He was a good communicator. He was good at letting you know.
Very good communicator. Yes, absolutely.
And just to clarify, when you talk about putting the buckles not on the most sensitive part, does that vary between horses, or is there kind of a rule of thumb of where the buckles should be?
It does vary somewhat between horses. I always say, well, just run your thumb gently down over the girth area. And if there is an area which is very sensitive on any particular horse, so they react by the skin contracting repeatedly, then avoid buckles over there.
Oh, that's great. That's another really good way that people can do figure things out themselves, which is what we want to help provide. I think that's all I had.
We are coming up on 1 hour. So
okay, well, then I'll shut up because I can talk about this all day with Dr. Dyson.
Well, it just goes to show that, and we did a really good job of talking about so many aspects of this issue, and yet there's more. There's more in-depth information that Dr. Dyson has, and I'm sure there are more questions that we'll get after this, and obviously, Jody, that you even just have yourself. So did you want to have anything to wrap things up there, Jody, or?
I think that covers it all.
Okay.
Oh yeah, do you want to do some announcements about what we have coming up?
Yeah, I wanted to just wrap things up a little bit on our end. We are going to continue doing these live conversations with Dr. Dyson. We will be posting the dates of those ahead of time on our website. So you can always check in 24horsebehaviors.org. You can also check out trainwithtrustproject.org. We will post those dates and the lives and their topics ahead of time. And of course, keep following us on whatever social media you are following us. Because there is so much dense information about this saddle and saddle fit topic, we are planning to do a full detailed presentation. And when I say we, I mean Dr. Dyson is gracious enough to offer a recorded presentation with all of this information. So it won't be immediate, but in the coming months, keep an eye out for that. We have also, of course, the 24 behaviors of the ridden horse in pain, the ridden horse pain ethogram, mobile field guide that has illustrations that kind of detail the key points of how to look at those behaviors. We have recently gotten offers to translate those into different languages. So we have a number of languages in process. We are still looking for translations for Dutch, German, and Portuguese. So if any of you out there are fluent, know people who are fluent and would want to do those translations of the mobile field guide to Dutch, German, and Portuguese, that would be fantastic.
Or any other languages that we may or may not have. I can just
Absolutely
reach out and we'll let you know if we have it or not. There's a lot of languages.
Yeah. And so you can contact us via social media, and you can also check in with us at that we have contact us forms on both 24horsebehaviors.org, trainwithtrustproject.org. And last but not least, always keeping an eye on deepening the knowledge of the 24 behaviors and the ridden horse pain ethogram. There is a course that you can take for more detail about using the ridden horse pain ethogram effectively through Equitopia, and their website, I believe, is Equitopia Center. Pardon, my dog had to sneeze. Equitopiacenter.com. So these are all resources we want to recommend to everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for your questions that you submitted ahead of time. And we're so excited to keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, Dr. Dyson, for continuing this conversation and helping people really understand all of these really nuanced topics.
Yes, thank you.